And here we are in session 3 with Grandpa Dave, telling family stories, getting some of the family history. Still November the 19th, 2016. And we were talking about going to Alaska, and you said that you were on the train going to Seattle when you got a telegram, which was quite unusual, getting a telegram on a train. Right?
Right, and that the dock workers in Seattle said the dock workers were on strike and our ship was not going to sail the next day. We had expected just to ride out there on the train, get off and get on the ship and go. But fortunately, Margaret, Paul's wife in Anchorage, her parents still lived in Seattle, so they agreed to take us in for a few days until our ship would go. So we were thankful for that, and in the meantime, Margaret's sister, who was a teenager, took us on little sightseeing tours of Seattle, so that was a nice beginning for the trip. When we got to Anchorage, Paul and Penn, my uncle and aunt, were there to meet us, take us to our tent where we were going to live for the summer. My friend Harold Larson and I were going to live together and do construction work in Anchorage, which we did. And one of Harold's projects was to shoot a bear, and there was a bear that had been eating my uncle's groceries out of the spring. They didn't have electricity, so they kept their food cool by floating in kettles in the spring. And Harold sat up all night one night waiting for the bear to come. The bear came, and he shot the bear and killed it. He was pretty happy, although he wasn't so happy trying to tan the hide. And it never was successful, so he never ended up with a bear rug.
Did you have bear meat, fresh bear meat then?
Yeah, wasn't too good.
Wasn't very good.
Kind of greasy. One of our adventures, though, was coming home. We hunted around for cheap transportation, and we found a charter flight from Anchorage to Seattle that was going to be $89 or $79 or something, a lot less than the scheduled airlines.
Were you in a hurry to get back? You couldn't take the boat and the train again?
No, we didn't. It was too expensive. This was a lot cheaper than the train would be the same, but the boat was a lot more expensive than the airplane. So anyway, we signed on and we got to the airfield where the plane was supposed to leave, but they didn't have any agreement to load passengers, so you had to walk out onto the field with your suitcase or whatever, find your plane just sitting in the grass. Nothing happened. Finally, two guys showed up, opened the door of the plane, had a poster board kind of thing, and they fastened that, taped that onto the cockpit door, and it was the name of their charter company. That was the only thing we knew, who was running this flight. So anyway, they loaded our luggage in, and then they took off their mechanics' clothes, and they had pilot's clothes, so we knew at least we had a pilot and a co-pilot. And we got in, and we didn't have seats. They had what they call bucket seats. A bucket seat was made for your parachute. They didn't have parachutes, but if you had a parachute, you would put your parachute in the bucket seat and sit on the parachute. And we got underway okay, and they, after a while, they had a thermos of coffee and they went around serving coffee, so they were the flight attendants also. And so we kept going, and several of us noticed that the plane had turned around. The moon was on the other side. And they announced that the regular place where they were going to land was fogged in, so we were going to go to Juneau instead. So about 3 or 4 in the morning, we arrived in Juneau. Nobody was there. The terminal was dark. Gas pumps were dark. But the pilot got out, and there was a payphone there outside in the parking lot. And the pilot put in the money and called the gas truck. In about an hour, a sleepy gas truck driver arrived with some gas for us, so we could continue on. When we got to Seattle, again, we didn't have any permit to go to the terminal, so we ended up out in the field lugging our suitcases back to where we could get some transportation. So that was the dramatic ending of our Alaska adventure.
It was your first summer, at the end of the first summer in Alaska.
That was the end of our first summer in Alaska.
And then you took the train back to Minnesota?
Yeah.
And then you started college at Gustavus Adolphus.
Yeah.
And you were a history major, right?
History major. Wanted to be a high school teacher.
Still at that point, huh?
I actually didn't go around to visit any other colleges, because in Cambridge, if you were a member of the Lutheran Church, you just went to a Lutheran college. You didn't check around to see which ones might be better or worse. It was kind of like you owe your soul to the company store. And other people were going to, so that seemed to be a reasonable thing.
Did you consider Gustavus the best of the Lutheran colleges? Is that?
I didn't even think about the other Lutheran colleges. If you were in Cambridge and member of the Lutheran Church in Cambridge, you just went to Gustavus unless you couldn't afford it. One of my friends, Kenneth Scogan, couldn't afford it, so he went to St. Cloud Teachers College instead.
Had he come to Alaska with you, he could have maybe earned enough to afford it with you guys.
I never invited him. I was entitled only to invite one person. So anyway, my mother and Aunt Hazel drove me down to college, and there was a new dormitory there. And I was assigned to a room in the new dormitory, and found my room and my desk, and one of my roommates had already moved in, and his pipe was sitting there with tobacco and stuff, and my mother didn't think too much of that, or my Aunt Hazel told me to watch out for pipe smoking. But then, a little later than that, I discovered that the others, there was a section for 12 people. There were 6 rooms with 2 people in each one. And then a group of students from Minneapolis, they had some kind of an inn where they had reserved all 12 rooms for their little group. And a couple of them were pretty prominent, like one of them was a young doll whose father was the governor had been the governor of Minnesota. So I got bumped. They said it'd be good if I adjusted and took some different roommate instead. My assigned roommate never talked to me, but the people in charge of housing talked to me. That they had another good roommate for me. So I thought, well, I'll try that out. That was Virgil Juliet.
My godfather, huh?
Yeah. So he became one of my best friends next to Harold Larson. So in a short time in high school and college, I had two of my lifelong friends.
And he had come back, he was on the GI Bill, he had come
Yeah,
back
he had-
from the service.
So he was a sophomore already. He had lots of war stories to tell. He had been a navigator on the flights over Tokyo. And his plane hadn't dropped the atomic bomb, but it was a plane that was exactly like his that had made test runs to see how it was going to work and stuff.
It was part of his squadron or something, wasn't it?
Part of what?
His squadron or something?
Flop?
Squadron?
His squadron, yeah.
Yeah, the Enola Gay.
Yeah, the Enola Gay was part of it.
Yeah.
So he saw them later loading the Enola Gay onto that plane. Secret Service came to interview
It was
him.
Big Boy or Little Boy or something like that was the name of it.
I think so.
Yeah.
Fat man.
That's
Fat
why
Man.
I'm
Little Boy.
interested to see how much of that is going to be in this book, Killing the Rising Sun.
Mm.
Anyway, he was 19 years old, and the navigator on this plane. So after they got to Tokyo, everybody was tired and everybody went to sleep. He was the only one awake on the airplane, and they didn't have radio or anything. He had to observe the stars and stuff to make sure they were going the right way and on the right flight. And the wind would affect it the only way. They have the wind. They were on radio silence and stuff. He had to peer down at the ocean, try to figure out which way the waves were going and calculate how much that was affecting the flight.
Mm.
So I was pretty impressed with that.
So, and he was flying back to where?
To one of the islands where the atomic bomb was and stuff.
Mm.
They had to find, and it was up to him to find that island for them. Pilots were asleep and other crew members were asleep. That was a lot of responsibility for 19.
So was it an automatic pilot, or was he actually having to pilot as he navigated?
So he didn't pilot that, no.
It was on automatic then.
Right.
Okay. So that was the start of college
Yeah.
with Virgil. Was Harold Larson there at Gustavus
Well,
too?
he went to, did go to North Park College for a year. He was never planning to go to Gustavus.
Was he Lutheran?
Yeah, Augustana. And but in the same section that Virgil was in were the Bergs, Don and Dean Berg. So that's when I met them.
This is not part of that exclusive group from
No,
Minneapolis.
they were their own group up on a different floor in the dormitory.
Were they like the classy people to know if you were important, you knew them, but if you were not that important, you were then outside of that group?
Yeah, I had kind of that feeling that they didn't consider me equal to them. I didn't know from one thing to another who they really were. I knew they were well connected.
They were the city folk, though, and you were one of the hicks from the small towns,
I had that
farmers.
kind of feeling.
So you were a history major, and I'm guessing it was during your college that you decided you needed to become a pastor and a missionary?
At first, I wasn't the missionary part. It was just becoming a pastor that I thought if I was going to teach something, maybe I should teach religion. And so the only people I knew who were teaching religion were pastors. So I thought, if I'm going to be a teacher and teach religion, then I should become a pastor.
So you never really felt like a call to save people's souls, or particularly, or
No, I wanted to educate people. Education, I was a firm believer in education.
wanted to be a teacher all the way, huh?
Right.
And so pastoring just became sort of a path to the kind of teaching you thought you wanted to do.
A means to an end.
Hmm.
And I didn't know quite how to tell my folks or the other family people that I felt like I should become a pastor. And so I talked to one of my counselors at college, and he said, well, why don't you live with this decision for a while? You don't have to tell people right away, and see if you feel more strongly or less strongly about it after a while. And I did that, and I actually felt more strongly about it as time went by. And I was active in the Lutheran student movement. That was people in college that wanted to have meetings of different kinds, conferences and stuff. And they also had what was called the missionary society. You didn't have to become a missionary to belong to that, but you spread the word in congregations about that Gustavus had a mission society, and if they gave money to that, that was one way to give money to missions. And we advertised that by visiting congregations on days when there wasn't a regular pastor, and that was usually when there was a synod meeting. Pastors would take the day off, but if they could get a student or somebody, a lay person, somebody else to do the service, they would do that. So a number of congregations would ask the college to send a student. So Virgil and Don and Dean and I and a bunch of others, we would go out on these trips. I would especially go with Don. And my first assignment was Halleck, Minnesota, which was way up on the Canadian border. And we had a missionary car. Whoever went the farthest would drop people off at the different places and then have the car at the end and then pick them all up on the way back. So that was my job. Again, it was kind of adventure for me. One of the places I remembered was Rush Lake, Minnesota, which isn't that far from Cambridge. It was a big church out in the country, and Don and Dean and I drove up, and we found the church, the doors and windows were open and smoke was pouring out. It was in the spring, and the furnace had backed up, so it was kind of a smoke out. But they were airing out the church. There was no fire, just a lot of smoke. And that day, Don was preaching and I was doing the liturgy. That's how we divided the job. I remember sitting up in front because I was doing the liturgy. And when it came time for the sermon, Don climbed up into the pulpit. It was one of those old churches where they had the high pulpits with a little stairway to go up in from the back.
Mm-hmm.
Don walked up to the back and up into the pulpit. He was ready to start his sermon. He looks out. He can't see anything. It's mostly smoke. As it turned out, there were only 11 people in church. They all were sitting under the back balcony. So he kind of preached into this room full of smoke. Those kinds of things I remember.
So did anything else particular happen during college or college years that are memorable?
Well, not during that year, that second summer, because Harold's parents thought of me as kind of a second son, that I was willing, they were so happy that I was willing to take him to Alaska, that they took me on a trip to the East Coast with them when they were camping. So my second summer I spent 3 of the weeks visiting national parks and Gettysburg Cemetery and Statue of Liberty and Independence Hall, all kinds of churches and museums and stuff on the East Coast.
This is probably the summer of 48.
48, the summer of 48.
And then did you end up going back to Alaska that summer later, or?
No, I never went. I worked in the laundry again while I could, and then part of the time Harold set me up with a job in Chicago, helping take care of a Catholic cemetery. So I became an employee of the Chicago Cardinal.
You were mowing grass and stuff in the
Mowing
cemetery?
grass. I mean, I discovered how you get tips by mowing grass in a cemetery. You watch when people come in to plant flowers or check on their graves, and then you rush up as soon as possible and start mowing like mad their particular plot, and then they're impressed with your work, and then you go back later and they leave the tip on the tombstone.
And were you able to make enough money that summer to
Pay for college.
pay for college again?
Yeah,
Oh, good job. So you were thrifty, you were saving up all your money.
yeah,
Probably didn't have a girlfriend still?
no.
Too expensive, couldn't afford one, too busy?
Well, I had a nurse. One of the girls at Cambridge High School that graduated with me went into nursing, so I dated her a few times. She was at Bethesda Lutheran Hospital in St. Paul, but she didn't seem that interested in me. I was more interested in her, so I sort of dropped that.
And then more college, more summers?
Second year in college, pretty much like the first one. I was declared as a ministerial candidate. I joined one of the fraternities, was mostly people with church relations and expecting to be pastors. So
What was the name of your fraternity?
Alpha Phi Omega. I think it's out of business now.
Do you still have your paddle?
I still have my paddle.
Did they paddle you with that as part of your initiation?
Yeah, more ceremonial than anything else.
It wasn't painful, you didn't have any bruises?
So.
Okay.
But meanwhile, my Uncle Paul had hatched a new plan. He had this old truck that he could buy for a few $100s, and he wanted me to drive it up to Alaska on the Alcan Highway. He would pay the expenses connected with it, so I wouldn't have to spend any money on transportation. And I could bring another student with me.
Just one, or you could bring more this time?
Just one.
Just one again.
Just one. I think that was right. Yeah, just one. So anyway, I asked Virgil if he was interested. And he was interested. And he was older than I was, quite a bit older. Well, not quite a bit, 5 years older. And I figured he'd be a good kind of mature person to have with me. Knew some things about mechanics and stuff. So we took this old truck to a mechanic to check it out, and he said, oh yeah, he said that would make it. So we took his word for it. We got as far as the Montana border with Canada and got stopped by the Canadian government that because of the appearance of our truck, we would have to be bonded in case the thing broke down. They didn't want penniless travelers broken down on the Alaskan highway. So we called Uncle Paul, said they want some money. We're stuck now, can't go any farther, we don't have any money. So he ordered some people in Minnesota to send us money by Western Union. The closest place was the local railroad station in Montana. But they were a little uncertain how long it would take, so we started camping. Only there was no campsite, we just picked the pasture, set up camp. We had 50-gallon drum of gasoline because it was going to be really expensive per gallon on the Alaskan highway. So to save money, we had this tank of gasoline. But when we were camping, we had violent electrical storms, so we were afraid it might strike our gasoline can and we'd be blown up. So we rolled the gasoline can onto a hill where if it blew up, it wouldn't affect us. Fortunately, it never blew up. After a while, the money came. The Canadian government let us in. We got as far as the highest point in the highway, and the engine went slower, slower, and slower. And the gas stations were about 50 miles apart at that time. So as the truck kind of slowed to a stop, Virgil was in the rider's side. I was driving. I don't think he swore. He was pretty religious. And if he had sworn, I think he would have said, "What the hell?" Anyway, he got out and he slammed the door as hard as he would, and he broke the window on the rider's side. So now we had a truck that wouldn't run and a truck with a broken window. And I agreed to stay with the truck so that nobody took our stuff. And Virgil went off to hitchhike to the nearest gas station. And it turned out there was a station only 6 miles away. So after about an hour or two, Virgil comes back with the mechanic from the gas station. He looks us over and he says, "Oh, all you need are new spark plugs." And so he put the spark plugs in right there and off we went. Then we found a big piece of cardboard to put in the window. So the only other battle on the way up there was with the mosquitoes. We were in some places where I've never seen mosquitoes that bad. we couldn't eat, like we'd make a fire and sit around it. We couldn't eat by the campfire because you'd open your mouth. The mosquitoes would chase right in after the food. We did have mosquito netting for the back of the pickup. We slept in the back of the pickup. It was a pickup truck. So we would grab a little cup of food or something and dash in and eat behind the mosquito net.
Mm.
But we got there.
Let's stop the recording there.